This video is an addendum to the last video I did on the Harbor Freight jig. Much of the information in this is wrong. This Harbor Freight jig and this Woodstock jig are the same exact kind, but this manual that I found online is correct. The Woodstock Dovetail Jig D2796 is the user manual that you can use for your Harbor Freight dovetail jig. Take this, throw it away. This manual from Woodstock is a lot more informative than the one from Harbor Freight. The Woodstock manual gives you a chart how far to set your fence back depending upon the value here from the side of your bushing to the edge of your router. So it makes it extremely easy to set your fence. The Harbor Freight manual does not have that. The Harbor Freight manual says your dovetail bit is supposed to be 1/2 inch from the base of your router. That's really incorrect because I've used a 1/2 inch and that does not work. The Woodstock manual says 9/16, and in my last video I said 18 30-seconds or even 19 30-seconds would be the ideal height for your bit, and 9/16 is 18 30-seconds. I'll post a link to this PDF in the comment section down below, and so this is the manual you should be using for your Harbor Freight dovetail jig, because these are exactly the same. There's also a CraftX jig that is exactly the same. I think these are just Chinese mass-produced jigs and labeled for Harbor Freight or Woodstock or other company names. So I bought a Irwin bit from Lowe's. This was about $19, and we'll see how it works compared to the Harbor Freight bit. So you can see the shank on the Irwin bit is much longer than the shank on the Harbor Freight bit by almost 1/4 of an inch. So this will seat deeper into the collet, and you won't have, you know, your bit coming out and hitting your jig. So I've got my ruler set at 9/16. Tighten your collet nut down till you feel a little bit of tension on your bit, and pull your bit out, and then slowly push it in till the depth gauge or the ruler touches the face of the router and sits square on there. And carefully tighten up your collet nut. Spin it around, make sure nothing's grinding on the template guide and the collet nut is not touching the brass fitting. And remeasure. Make sure that it's at the 9/16 depth. So according to the instructions, you find out the value of X. Then you measure the thickness of your stock, which is 3/4 of an inch. So you measure from the side of the template guide to the edge of your router. So this is about 21 30-seconds on this specific router. And the distance on your router will vary if it's not a Harbor Freight exactly like this. 2 inches and 21 30-seconds, and using 3/4 inch stock, we would go back 3 inches and 31 30-seconds. So from the front of this, we'd go back 3 inches and 31 30-seconds. So we'll loosen up the fence. I have my square set at 3 inches and 31 30-seconds. So it says here in this manual, for vertical pieces that are 7/8 inch thickness or less, the fence should be 1/8 of an inch back from the front edge of the vertical piece. So I've got my ruler set at 1/8 of an inch. Another thing the Harbor Freight manual does not mention is setting up the horizontal piece to be centered in between the teeth of the comb. See here how it is centered. The Harbor Freight manual does not mention that. Feel, or you can use a gauge or a ruler of some kind. This fits exactly on the sides of the fingers. Make sure it's up against the vertical piece. Then loosen up the bolt for the pin stop and push it up against the side of the horizontal stock. Take your 1/2 inch shim, slip it in from the bottom and line it up with the side right here of the horizontal piece. And then make sure your vertical piece is up against the comb. And then you can push your shim out and lock down your vertical piece. Then move your vertical pin stop all the way over and tighten down the bolt. That should be all you have to do to set up your dovetail jig so far, according to the new instructions. That's a little bit deep. So now I got a nice tight flush fit on the dovetail. Instead of 3 inches and 31/32, I'm using, I think, 3 inches and 30/32.